My name is Michael Marmur. I am, to give you my full title, the Jack, Joseph and Morton Mandel Provost of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Needs my whole breath just to give you my title. HUCJR is an academic seminary institution affiliated with the Reform movement. We've been around since 1875. We have 3 campuses in the United States and 1 here in Jerusalem where I live. And I serve as the chief academic officer of the school, working with faculty, dealing with issues of curriculum and academic status and all of those kind of things. I'm also myself somebody who works in the field of modern Jewish thought. I wrote my doctoral dissertation about Abraham Joshua Herschel. I have a book on Herschel which is due to come out in the coming months, published by the University of Toronto Press. I've published articles, I go to conferences. I'm what they call a Herschelist, which is what a Herschel specialist gets called. And I'm one of a group, quite a large group now, of scholars, Jews and non-Jews, Israelis, Europeans, Americans, folks from other continents, other religions, who are engaging with the life and work of Herschel. Abraham Joshua Herschel was born in 1907. He died in 1972, so he only lived 65 short years. But in the course of his lifetime, it seems that he managed, or he also because of the sad and tragic realities of Jewish history in the 20th century, his life mirrored or echoed many of the great events of what you might call the arc of the modern Jewish experience. He was born to a Hasidic Jewish family, one with enormously strong ties, genealogical ties. He was, if you like, a prince of Hasidism. Figures like the Maggid of Mezrich, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, Yisrael of Rizhin, Avraham Yoshua Herschel of Apt, these were his ancestors. He was a blood descendant of all of these individuals. He was born in Warsaw, so he was growing up in a large cosmopolitan city, and in the course of his childhood, whilst he was living this ultra-Orthodox existence, he also became exposed to different ideas that were flying around the Jewish world at that time. In his teens, he decided that he wanted to match his profound Jewish education. I should tell you that he had an amazing memory. He knew really the great canonical works of Jewish literature, the Bible, the Talmudic literature, Midrash, medieval literature and so forth. He just knew it in a way that most people don't have that degree of learning or memory. But he wanted to match that profound Jewish literacy with a general education. He moved from Warsaw to Vilna, a city known as Vilnius today, in Lithuania. There he studied and got himself a general education certificate. He also became part of a group of Yiddish poets known as Jung Vilna, and he was writing poetry. Some of that poetry is now being set to music, and creative young people in North America and Israel are coming back to that poetry and looking at it again. From Vilna, he made his way to Berlin. So we're talking about really one of the great centers, cultural and social centers of anywhere in the world, in Europe between the wars. It was in Germany that he enrolled at the university to do his doctorate, writing his doctoral dissertation about prophecy and the prophets of ancient Israel. And also he came to rabbinical school. It's interesting that he enrolled in the Reform Rabbinical Academy. Later in life, he was asked, are you Orthodox, are you conservative, are you an Orthodox Jew, a conservative Jew, a Reformed Jew? He said, I do not see myself as a noun in search of an adjective. So he was not so interested in those categories, if you like. But he went to study in the Reform Rabbinical Seminary, probably because there he felt he had something new to learn. He had much of the grounding that he needed in a kind of, he had a profound grounding in traditional Jewish sources. He, during his time in Germany, was one of a group of intellectuals who were really enriching Jewish life in the German Jewish community, including at a time of great crisis after the rise of the Nazis to power. It's in Berlin that Herschel becomes exposed to the worst of what modern ideologies can produce in the world. And I believe that that had a profound impact on his political formation, on his social ideology, on his spiritual approach. Herschel wrote that in a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible. So he knew that there are some things that happen where a particular person is guilty of a crime, but all of us are responsible for what has taken place. None of us can hide behind our innocence and say it's not our problem, it's nothing to do with us. This is a message that he took with him to the 1960s in America, but I believe that he learned it in the 1930s in Germany. Whilst living in Nazi Germany, Herschel is exposed to the most extreme example, perhaps in all of human history, of the human illusion that you can rule over physical space, you can control people's consciousness, and you can then create a 1,000-year Reich, that you can ultimately control time. And Herschel learns from this experience, drawing from his spiritual Hasidic background, that there needs to be another way of understanding the relationship between the dimension of time and the dimension of space, and that this is both a religious and spiritual imperative and also a political and social one. Herschel himself leaves Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. The institution that I work for, the Hebrew Union College, its president at that time, President Morgenstern, has a special project to bring out scholars from Europe and bring them over to the United States. And so by the time he's arrived in 1940, Herschel arrives in Cincinnati, Ohio, one of the campuses of the college. And thereafter, in 1945, Herschel moves to the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the seminary, rabbinical seminary of the conservative movement in the United States. He lives in New York from 1945 all the way through until his death in 1972. What are the key aspects of Herschel's thought? Well, you have to read many books and articles, not only my ones, in order to understand that. It's not an easy thing to say while standing on one leg. But here are a few key ideas. One is, Herschel is a generalist. He has a panoramic approach, both within Judaism. He wrote about every major period of Jewish creativity. You know, most scholars will write about one period of time, one particular genre of literature, and they usually are very suspicious of people who want to write about everything. But Herschel's basic understanding of life and of Jewish life is that it needs to be understood as a great broad spectrum. And so he writes about the Bible. He writes about the rabbis, the rabbinical literature. He writes about the great figures of medieval thought. He writes about Hasidism. He writes about prayer. He writes his own theological works. all in 65 short years, he produces an enormous range, okay? But not only does he have a panoramic view within Judaism, he has a universalistic approach, which means that whilst he's very rooted in his own Jewish identity, he believes that the big questions are bigger even, or are not exclusive to the Jewish condition. So he is very engaged with an interreligious, pan-human, trans-categorical approach, looking to find connections between people wherever they are. And so we find Herschel forging relationships with other religious thinkers, but also with political activists, in a remarkable way. Herschel in the 1960s becomes one of the great iconic figures of the struggle for civil rights for Black Americans or African Americans, and also towards the very end of his life, the struggle against US military involvement in Vietnam. And in the course of those campaigns, he becomes connected to, allied with, a number of men and women of different commitments and faiths with whom he finds this kind of interpersonal connection. Perhaps the most famous relationship of this kind was with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The year of King's assassination, Martin Luther King, was meant to be celebrating the Passover Seder at the table of the Herschel family in New York. They developed a really strong relationship. They both read the literature of the prophets, the literature of the Bible, and they found within that literature a bond, a call, a commitment to be involved in the world, to make the world a better place. So one aspect of Herschel's particular unique contribution is this broad, universalist, panoramic approach. Herschel believed that each of us as individuals are being called, he would say, being called by God. Every day a voice calls out from Har Horeb, from Mount Horeb, calling to people. Herschel quotes sources of Jewish tradition in everything he says. There are thousands of quotations and references and citations, but he's not quoting them in order to show you how much he knows. He's quoting them because he believes that out of the voice of Jewish tradition, there is some essential human interaction taking place. So what are we called to do? We are called to treasure the humanity within each and every one of us. We are called not to allow the impersonal forces that are taking place all around us, that are acting upon us within society, interests of power, commercial interests, all the rest of it. We should not allow those forces to silence us, to paralyze us. We should never allow them to become a barrier which stands between you and me, which stops me seeing the basic humanity in the other person. That's why he was very committed to a number of pacifist causes. That's why he was involved so much in some of the big campaigns and struggles. That's why he was invited during the presidency of JFK, of John Kennedy, to speak at the White House about health, aging, youth, some of the big social questions on the agenda. I want to say something about the Sabbath that also links us most particularly with this extraordinary initiative of the Castle in Time Orchestra. Why does the Sabbath matter so much to Herschel? You know, he would often give talks to different audiences, and in a number of them he suggested that if you wanted one word, one concept, which expressed more than any other the essence of life and of Jewish life, that word would be the Sabbath. What is it about the Sabbath which is so important? Is it that, I don't know what, we eat a heavy meal and have a sleep in the afternoon, or no. The point about the Sabbath is it is an expression of a human self-understanding of our own limitations. He had lived in a world in which people, men, mainly men, believed they ruled time and ruled space. He also believed that in our modern times we value things in the dimension of space much more than we do value things in the dimension of time. So we look around and we say, how rich am I? It depends how many things I own, okay? How big is my house? How many square feet do I own? That's what we think we really own. Whereas Herschel believed this was an essential mistake. All the things in the dimension of space, we know one thing about them. They live in time for a short time, and then they disappear. You can't see it on the camera, but next to me there's a table. Here's the table. I know it exists. I think it really is here. It exists in a very significant way because I can touch it and feel it. But when I look at it from the dimension of time, I realize this used to be a bunch of ingredients. Maybe a tree was involved in this table, I'm not sure, okay? This used to be different. It had a different form in space earlier in time. And we know that if you just wait a little bit of time, it will be recycled and turn into something else. We fall prey to the illusion that we really are strong and rich because at this particular moment in time, we have things. But this is an illusion. We want to deny the passage of time. That's why plastic surgeons do very good business in modern society, because age is a scandal. We want to pretend that we're not decaying or changing in time. We are trying to deny time because we are trying to make ourselves divine. Time, wrote Herschel, is the dimension in which we become aware of the presence of God in the world. And idolatry is when we try to freeze out the dimension of God and the dimension of time. We believe that things in space, we also believe that the work of our own hands is somehow ultimate, but it's not ultimate. The Sabbath is a moment when a person who lives in civilization, in the world of doing, reminds himself or herself that there is more to life than doing, that there is also being. The Sabbath is a time when you realize that you cannot manipulate and control everything in the world all the time. That you have to sometimes stand back and let the world speak to you. That you are not always the subject, that we are also the object. I don't mean that I'm an object like this table. I mean that God is turning to us, looking to us, calling to us. We don't like that message, says Herschel. We want to believe that we are in control all the time. We are not. Herschel was not against technological civilization, but he was afraid that if we give technological civilization the ultimate status, if we believe that you can be in control 24/7, every day of the year, all the time, that our life is like one of those supermarkets that never closes, okay? Then we lose some essential truth about the world and about our lives. We should try to be involved in technological civilization 24/6. But there should be a moment in the week in which we remind ourselves of the true balance between the dimension of time and the dimension of space. I'll say one more thing about the Sabbath. There was some criticism from Zionist circles of his book. He writes this book in 1951, 3 years after the creation of the State of Israel. And there seems to be very little mention or no mention of the Jewish state, which is all about the dimension of space. Later on in his life, he wrote a very romantic book about Israel after the Six-Day War in 1967. But the critique from some circles was that he was so much committed to the idea of time, which takes you outside contemporary historical events, that he wasn't prepared to be engaged in this great adventure of space, which is the story of contemporary Israel. What is fascinating today, and that leads us to this remarkable project, is that in the last few years, decades after Herschel has died, more and more young Israelis are engaging with some of the core ideas and insights that Herschel had to offer. There has been a great amount of interest. There are conferences. Some of my colleagues have translated important works by Herschel into Hebrew. My colleague Dror Bondi published a selection of Herschel's essays, which became a sort of mini bestseller in Israel. Kind of a fantastic story. It's remarkable in many ways. So even though there's something about Herschel's message which is difficult for Israelis perhaps to relate to, there are more and more expressions amongst academics, religious thinkers, artists, musicians, who are engaging with some of Herschel's ideas and themes. We live in a world of dichotomies, a bifurcated world in which we are told you have to be one thing or another. Jewish Israelis have been brought up to believe you are either religious or secular. You are either interested in the things of this world, or you're connected to the things of the next world. You are either a proud Jewish nationalist, or you are a left-wing progressive. Herschel's teachings can help undermine some of those false dichotomies. Okay? So that is why around the Jewish world, people who are interested in what you might call a spirituality agenda, Jewish meditation and spiritual examination and interreligious dialogue, they look to Herschel as a model for their activity. But at the same time, people who are involved in political activism, people who are involved in social organization and change, also look to Herschel. I can give you an example that here in Israel there is an institution that is connected to ecological, environmental awareness and Judaism, and calls itself the Herschel Institute. Now, did Herschel ever write directly about green questions, about environmental questions? Not so much. But in his work on the Sabbath, he raised this idea of what it means to understand the limits of our control over the natural world we inhabit. Now, Herschel, as I've mentioned, has an increasingly strong resonance in the lives of Israelis, which is, I think, an irony or a fact he would have been very pleased about. He used to visit Israel quite often and speak, but when he came here, often it was difficult for people to hear him. I'll give you an example. He came in the late 1950s, and he wrote about it. He said, I speak to soldiers in the army, and they tell me that in their unit where they serve in the army, there is a rabbi who comes along to check if the food that they are eating is kosher. But there is no rabbi who comes along to talk with them, to ask them if the things they do as soldiers, are those things kosher. In other words, that the rabbinate is all about formal halachic categories. He was orthodox in his lifestyle. He was observant of the rules of Jewish tradition. He wasn't against them, but he didn't believe that that was the whole story. And he was worried that if your rabbi only cares about whether the tchina is kosher, okay, or the falafel is kosher, but doesn't ask the core questions, what am I doing when I hold the gun and wear the uniform, then we are limiting the Jewish conversation to something trivial and not really grappling with the big issues. Herschel lived in the dimension of time, which means that he was very involved in contemporary questions. He had radical opinions. In 1963, he attended a conference in Chicago on religion and race. That is where he met Martin Luther King. That is where that relationship began. And he spoke about examples of racial hatred, okay, in a way that this was not just, he wasn't being polite. He spoke with a kind of fierce passion that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible spoke with. I'm talking to you and saying these words on a day in the city of Jerusalem when people who marched in the Pride Parade yesterday were attacked by a man with a knife. We're talking on a day in which a Palestinian family living near Shechem was burnt, in some cases to death, in the name of Jewish vengeance, of Nekama. For a man like Herschel, these are moments in time which we have to respond to, we have to relate to. We cannot just smile and say, well, things happen. But he wasn't only interested in the immediate passage of time in the world, he was also interested in a kind of great flow of eternity. So he was against the idea that either you are interested in the news or you are interested in God. God is in the news, and God is calling us to respond to the immediate. So then you might say, well, maybe there's no time for Shabbat, there's no time for the Sabbath. Not true. The Sabbath is how we recalibrate the relationship between the immediate things that happen in the world and the big questions of values and of principles which should guide us. Herschel was married to a classical musician, and he himself was very profoundly influenced by great music. Most of the great music he came from a tradition of the Hasidic song. He would say, for example, when you are sad, you cry. When you are more sad, you are silent. When you are profoundly sad, you sing. So music is an expression of profound emotion, of profound response. But then, as he became part of a kind of Western tradition, the great classical musical tradition really impacted upon him, and he would write occasionally and speak occasionally of the effect, the impact that some sublime music could have on him. And it's not surprising for a man who was so interested in time, yes? Music, unlike the visual arts, unlike other artistic expressions, is all about time. I have a friend who writes about philosophy of music and talks about one pause at the end of a piece by Beethoven. And it's difficult to understand whether as the music of Beethoven, what the pause means, because the piece is already over, so how do you need a pause? But Beethoven put the silence into the piece. These ideas, these experiences of the sublime and the beautiful in time were very profoundly influencing on the life and experience of Herschel himself. This orchestra, which is comprised of young, talented musicians from different backgrounds and fields, is trying to find an authentic, culturally resonant expression for some really profound ideas. It's remarkable to see how the orchestra engages with some of Herschel's key ideas about prophets and the prophetic tradition, about the Sabbath. It sees a castle in time, or as Herschel writes, a palace in time. What's that Herschelian idea? Other peoples, when you ask what do they give to the world civilization, they build great cathedrals and castles and buildings, and they can say, look, this is what we've done. But we Jews aren't so good at that. I mean, I'm sitting in a Jewish castle here in Jerusalem, in a beautiful building, but it's a building that will not last as the great message of our culture to the world. But maybe the idea of Shabbat, the idea of the Sabbath, that is our cathedral, that is our castle. And it's fascinating to see how the orchestra is grappling with some of these ideas and these insights. It is going to the poetry of Herschel and relating to that poetry. It's interesting to note that in North America today, there are various attempts, there have been over the last several years, to set Herschel's writing to music, to find a musical expression for some of Herschel's profound ideas. This orchestra brings a contemporary Israeli sensibility into conversation with some of the key ideas and insights of one of the 20th century's most important Jewish thinkers. The sad reality in the Jewish world today is that there are many forces driving people apart. Our cultural and political situations are different in, say, North America and in contemporary Israel. And it's very tempting to find increasingly high barriers which can separate our different worlds and realities. I want to suggest that art and ideas and experiences can help overcome those barriers. Here you have a group of young Israeli musicians and artists who are creating something remarkable and unique, which I believe may find a resonance, may create a connection with people, young and old, living outside Israel, who want to find a voice of Israel with which they can identify. They want to hear an echo of contemporary Israel, which fascinates, intrigues, attracts them and brings them in. I believe that through engagement with some of Herschel's key ideas, through great creativity and artistry, the work of this orchestra can really help create a link and a connection. And I believe that Herschel, who was so committed to the idea of people really connecting with each other across all the boundaries, across all the differences, I believe that this is the kind of project which really reflects positively and strongly his legacy.